Hello, and welcome to Red Rock Relationships, a podcast about communication. Let's unpack the relationships that we encounter in our daily lives and learn about what makes them tick. And now your host for Red Rock Relationships, Dr. James B. Stein.
All right, lights, camera, and action. We are rolling with, I guess, what is technically the season finale, although as I mentioned on the last episode, this is a little bit of a fake out season finale. We will next week be having one of those bonus family episodes that we did so many years ago, but enough about that. We will close out our season on green flags in talking about one of the greenest flags I think you could possibly have, which is humor. And to help me do that is last year's guest from way back when we were talking about all sorts of other different stuff, but an expert on the subject of humor, believe it or not, Dr. Tara Franks, joining us again. Thank you so much for being here.
And thank you so much for having me. Very excited to be here today.
Well, the first thing I ever learned about you, which was, and for the record, I know Tara because she was finishing her PhD the year that I began mine. And so she was in this like mentorship program where fourth-year students mentor first-year students. That's not what's important. What's important is that when I met her, she had just won the award for funniest instructor at Arizona State University, which is a really big deal because it's a gigantic university. And so when I thought about this episode, I was like, I know exactly who to call. So thanks for picking up the phone.
Yes, absolutely. And you know what's funny? That award meant a whole lot to me, actually, because I think I'm a woman. And if you remember, a lot of the other nominees, most of the other nominees, if I'm correct, all of them were men. And so I'm excited to talk about humor today, also because I have some gender things to talk about, some sex things to talk about, some relationship things to talk about, which I know is what you do here. So all kinds of good stuff.
No, you're dead on. I mean, even if you look at, for example, the world of stand-up and comedy, like that is an area that has been gate-kept by men pretty religiously. So yeah, really quite literally shattering the glass ceiling in the funniest way possible. Should we get into it?
Yes, let's go. I love it.
All right. I want to start pretty simple, but also in the utterly complex.
Yeah.
If we think about like online dating, for example, because I think this is the most applicable example, and you're just like scrolling, swiping through people, one of the things you're going to see on any random person's profile is something like, I want someone who can make me laugh. I think women might be a little bit more likely to say this than men, but I wouldn't know because when I date, I don't date men. So, but I imagine that this is something that everyone tends to include on their profile. My question, why do daters seem to value humor so much to the point where they're like explicitly mentioning it as they search for a significant other?
That's a great question. And there are so many reasons that we could dive into why that is the case. Now, a lot of research has suggested that humor, having a sense of humor, and a lot of the research has been done in heterosexual couples. So first, I want to situate us there.
You're kidding.
Yeah, right. But humor has actually been shown in the studies that we've done to be 5 times more important as a quality in your partner than even sex. Employers find it incredibly desirable. 80% actually of employers find it as a desirable quality in organizations. And again, like you said, in daters and online daters especially, rank it as one of the top 5 and often one of the top 3 qualities. And I think it's because, and we know it's because funny people are smart, and smart is very sexy. The reason why being funny is so smart is because you have to think about what does it take to generate and also appreciate things like wit and sarcasm and irony and parody and the 43 different styles, which just happen to know, of humor that exist within our world. Funny people are incredibly sexy and attractive for a variety of reasons, not just because of the intelligence and the intellect that it takes to both produce, right, as a humorist, but also appreciate humor as somebody who laughs alongside. But also it shows that from a cognitive space that we know how to deal, that we know how to cope, that we can relieve tensions, that we can deal with life's incongruities and stresses and crises, and that we can laugh at ourselves and at all the craziness that's happening around us. From an evolutionary perspective, it's wildly fascinating. You got to think about brute strength, right? Again, heterosexual society, big guy gets picked first because he's got the best genes and probably my best chances for reproductive success, right?
Mhm.
I'm the little guy. I know I don't have a very good success rate here because big dude's being picked. But if I can make fun of him and I can ridicule him in public, and I can get attention for standing out and show my intellectual superiority over that big dude and make everybody laugh, well, that is wildly entertaining. And suddenly I've increased my chances at being picked. And some of the reason why that happens is because when we laugh, not only is serotonin released, but the same part of the brain is activated. We call it the reward part of the brain. That is the same part, like when you get a punchline, for example, or you understand a joke or you laugh. And again, that serotonin is released. That is the same part of the brain, that reward zone, that is activated when you're having really good sex or when you're enjoying really delicious chocolate or a wonderful glass of wine or other substances, for example.
Dopamine. Dopamine
Dopamine,
is released. Yeah. Heck yeah.
100%. And we like that. And so that same response is occurring in the brain when we get in on that inside joke or we get that punchline or that humor response is activated. And so put all of those things together, and from an evolutionary, a biological, a cognitive, and an attractive space, humor is going to rank pretty high.
That is very intersectional and complete. Yeah, I think that I'm glad we saved humor for last because it really probably is our greenest flag that we can have. Yeah,
Yeah,
wow.
it's a huge green flag. And then back
Absolutely.
to what you said, women talk about desiring humor as in they want heterosexual, again, men who make them laugh, and men desire women who laugh at their jokes. So,
Hmm. I think I would like to pick that scab a little bit more, but sadly, we must
yeah,
move on. Um, one thing about humor is that it is inherently an expectancy violation.
yeah,
Now, we've talked with Dr. Laura Guerrero about expectancy violations theory quite a bit. We've brought it into other episodes. And so if you need a reminder, you're welcome to go back to those episodes. I actually forget the exact numbers. They're in there. I promise they're in there. Humor is inherently a violation of expectations. That's the funny part. Something happened that we were not expecting, and we evaluate it as being positive and rewarding. So we laugh or we chuckle or we smile. Here's the thing. It is possible for there to be a disconnection between sending and receiving humorous content. So my question to you as the expert on the matter is what are some of the things that might like distinguish good, fun, hearty humor from,
yeah.
we'll call it an inappropriate joke, if you catch my drift? What are the distinguishing factors there?
Well, humor, like you said, right? It gives the humorist, the person who's communicating, a license to deviate, to press up against the status quo, to violate those expectancies that we have as we walk around each and every day. And when we encounter those and they're appraised positively, we find it funny. But when the content is triggersome, or problematic, or introduces attention, that cognitive dissonance, which is actually what we talked about on my last episode,
Mm-hmm.
then it has a negative value or a negative appraisal attached to it. Humor has a dark side as well, and that's where we jump into the inappropriate bucket, or and the green flag turns into a red one. Humor can be bullying. It can provoke. In the same way that there are inside jokes and kinship is built and best friendships are solidified and romantic relationships are fostered, humor can also divide and exclude and outcast. It can be too soon. if the social or political or racial or gender or otherwise climates are brought into situations where they are unwelcomed or introduced in a way that is not yet ripe or ready for that particular context. Um, Folks do this thing where they do third party attribution with humor. Let's say, for example, that you hear an ageist joke. It didn't come out of your mouth. And so you're allowed to laugh because maybe you heard it in a Saturday Night Live skit or a stand up comedian made a joke. And you don't quite feel like an awful person for laughing at that joke, even though you know it's inappropriate because it came out of their mouth, not yours, right? So we have this sort of third party allowing that goes on. But when that gets a little too close to home and those cognitive little synapses that occur make it personal, they land in a space that is nearer, right, to what we have that's problematic or conflictual in our own life or value systems, those green flags turn into spaces that are yellow and then red. Also, when humor offends or disciplines, or it reminds us of something that occurred in our past, right? Maybe we were tardy once and a teacher said, "Oh, thanks for joining us today," right? That was a sarcastic remark that was made to discipline and inform that student of appropriate behaviors. And so sarcasm then later in life is going to remind us of that moment. And instead of being nostalgic, is going to reinforce disciplinary measures, right, that were taught to us and socialized as children. And so it's important that we think about those things, that humor also has this incredible function to critique and evaluate and bring on those types of behaviors as well, or those types of functions rather, that move it into that zone.
Yeah. Now I think about there's like for me at least there's two main like dimensions or maybe you call them continua that humor can fluctuate on broadly. And like the first is power, right? So
Mhm.
this is why it's often said that like good humor punches up, bad humor punches down. You're making fun of someone who's less powerful than you. It's just kind of a cheap shot, right? Um and then the second one, which you alluded to a number of times, is like relationship. You know what I mean? Like, I can make certain jokes with my close friends that I would not make in the presence of like my work colleagues, right? Or I can make certain jokes with my family that I might not make with my significant other, or vice versa. And so, like, the extent to which you know the person or audience is okay with these jokes being made should indeed dictate whether or not you choose to like open your mouth and like say the thing. And so should the power that you have vis-a-vis the power of the subject. That's what I'm like taking away from that. Is that close?
Yeah, 100%. And, going back to interpersonal relationships 101, we know that relationships are ruled and governed or are governed by rules, right? And
Mm,
boundaries. And I think, too, in a digital world where we move away from articulating those boundaries and those rules so clearly, even with our loved ones, or they get muddled by digital lines or otherwise ambiguous or uncertainty um, types of communication lines, then we leave ourselves, I think, open and subject to more risk when it comes to negotiating humor and our humor cycles or our sense of humor, right? And experimenting and exploring those lines with others. And to go back to what you were saying about humor, down and up, that's really consistent with what we would know as the superiority theory of humor. And that deals directly with power,
hmm.
right? It's why we laugh when somebody gets hit with a dodgeball in the face. It's not because we're horrible human beings, but there's that piece of us that says, oh my gosh, I'm so happy that wasn't me
Hmm.
as the victim,
That's that.
right?
That's the old German adage of
Yes,
Schadenfreude, which is one of my
yes.
favorite words.
Yeah, yeah, where you're releasing this cognitive
Hmm.
tension of thank goodness that that wasn't me, that poor individual. And so it's this juxtaposition of empathy, but also power. So,
Right. Interesting. Okay, so that actually dovetails very nicely with what I want to get into next. So I think the number you mentioned was 43 different types or styles of humor. Now, obviously, depending on relationship and power and appropriateness, etc., the the type of humor that we employ could be a green flag for some, yellow flag for others, a red flag for a third group. So broadly speaking, if you can speak in as broad a terms as you can, what are some genres of humor that are usually like safe and would be considered a green flag by just about everyone?
It's funny because I've done some humor consulting over my time,
Hmm.
and especially with organizations, and they've asked the same question. And so I'm sure that there are more than 43 styles of humor, but they start to sort of get combined and are not distinguishable or unique beyond a certain number, right? So if we take a look at our green flags, we can take a look at dry humor, wit, irony, parody, stories, hyperbole, exaggeration, improv. Uh, Bordering that line comes like self disparaging humor, puns, and one liners, for
Mm.
example, right? Dad jokes, you could say. As we move sort of along that continuum where we start to get into the yellow, we might see some teasing or slapstick, maybe some impressions or personations, pranks, maybe some idioms, awkward humor. I'm thinking like mid 2000s Zach Galifianakis style,
Between
right?
two ferns.
Exactly, 100% between the ferns, right? And then we move into what everybody would know as the reds, right?
Mm.
Where you have any of the isms, insults, too soon, darker black humor, political humor, and all the others that really function as call outs rather than call ins and put downs. And there are so many of those, right? Far too many to name. But sticking in those greens, I think that they're the more playful, the silly, the goofy, the ones that you would enact with groups of children, right?
Mm.
Those are the ones that tend to be safer.
That's such a good point about like, hey, if you can't say it around children,
Mhm.
consider what you're saying, right? Not necessarily don't say it, but consider it. And you
Yeah.
you also mentioned the difference between call outs and call ins, and I think that's so important, right? Good humor usually calls the audience in. When I took
Mhm.
improv classes in high school and to a lesser extent college, one of the big things that they always encouraged was call in, get people involved. Don't isolate. Don't put yourself on an island because that just makes the humor more risky. It can be done, but it's much more risky. And I think when it comes to daters and people in relationships, you want to make sure you're calling in and not calling out. It's a much safer, appropriate style of humor. Mm,
That's far more attractive because people want to be called in, right? And they want
right.
to captured and enamored, and they want that activation to occur, that reward place in the brain, right, to go off. And that's not going to happen when we're being exclusionary or through insult or sarcasm, right? That's not the first grader on the playground who pushes the girl that they have a crush on, right?
Right.
That's not going to work.
Right. Yeah. Very immature. Yeah. You want to watch out for that. Yeah. And it's so interesting because when I was first preparing to teach classes, I looked a lot at the humor literature on what you should and shouldn't say in the classroom, and like some of it's obvious, but then like for example, you mentioned self disparaging humor. You want to be real careful about that in the classroom. You don't want to disparage the class, right? You don't want to make it seem like the class is a waste of time. You don't want to insult other students, and like you can poke fun at yourself a little bit because you're the powerful entity, but too much and you risk losing credibility, right? And then like you want to incorporate some humor in the classroom, but not too much because you don't want people to think you're a joke. It's a balance. And the same goes for making relationships. It's a balance. You don't want to be seen as like a jester. You want to be seen as an equal who's got jokes, you know?
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. And especially with women, women have to be careful making self disparaging jokes as well, whether
Hmm.
that's in the classroom or in the workplace, because we know that it takes away from credibility, and that they are seen as less competent in their roles. Right. And then also, because we know from research with heterosexual couples that men want women who laugh at their jokes and tend to be slightly more intimidated by women who make the jokes,
Hmm.
right? That plays with the power dynamic in the couple as well. So there's a
Yeah.
lot of interesting stuff to dive into there.
All right. Well, speaking of that, the last substantive question I have for you is if you think about like a lasting relationship, I know that your relationship has been going on for quite some time. Congratulations. Uh,
Thank you.
um, what's one way that people in a relationship can keep that humor candle burning strong, lest you fall into like stale jokes or like the same routine, the same bit, you get into a rut. What are some simple ways in which people might be able to avoid or at least mitigate that potential?
Yeah, that's a great question because my partner and I, we both think that we are funny and we think that the other one is funny. But sometimes we lose sight of our former funny selves and we are, more serious and professional and parented versions in our 40s now of who we once were. And so, to keep that candle burning, I think it's really important that we loosen up and that we get silly, that you get spontaneous, that you get nostalgic in your humor and you remember the things that made not only you laugh, but your partner laugh in the beginning of your relationship. And you kind of get back to your humor roots, right? If you used to quote movie lines back and forth all the time, go and watch that funny old movie that just made you laugh until you cried and do that, right? Go and play some of those really silly board games that they now make where, it's a pie in the face or you have to wear glasses upside down and read something silly or wear a silly hat or things like that. um, those sound like very goofy things, but I think that when we bring about the unexpected, because that's exactly what humor does, and
Hmm.
well, right, it violates our expectations. When we break our routinized self and get back to some of who we were, I think it really helps the relationship flourish, right? We're in this day to day routine of being responsible adults. We're adulting, we're doing our chores, we're paying our bills, we are laying on the same side of the bed. We are doing all the things that we would normally be doing on a Tuesday or Wednesday or Thursday, but we are not laughing and being silly and being spontaneous and being uncertain and inviting that into our relationship in the way that maybe we did in the beginning when we didn't have those routines so cemented and concreted in our life. And so for me, I would say, get think about those expectancies and violate them a lot, and get silly and do the things that your partner might not expect you to do. Um, and that really keeps it fun and keeps you on your toes. And don't be afraid to show all of those green flags.
That's nice. I think about it makes me think about like the original relational dialectics theory, the dialectical tension of predictability and novelty, right? Where it's like, yeah, of course, you want someone who's predictable and you can depend on them, and at the same time, you want somebody who's gonna like hit you in the face with a pie. Maybe not literally,
Yes.
maybe like, but like, okay, wait, pie in the face. That's hilarious in my humble opinion. But if I were wearing a $250 coat, when you hit me in the face with that pie, I'd be like, you ruined my coat and I'm not laughing now. And I just
Yeah.
think that really goes back to, and like, for example, if you're with someone, you know that's your partner's nice jacket. You should, right? And then the
You should.
knowledge of, I'm not going to make the joke now
Yeah.
because you're wearing your nice clothes. I'm gonna wait till you get into your PJs and then I'm gonna pie you up good, right? Like that knowledge, I think, is an important caveat.
I think 100%. I mean, even just something, and it doesn't have to be right the literal pie in the face.
Hmm.
The pie in the face could be the surprise that you didn't see coming, saying something flirty, right? Saying something sexy, bringing something into the scene, into the room, into the dynamic that just is, goofy or different or is ironic or satirical or otherwise, right? Like we were saying, unexpected and bust through your relationship status quo. Humor doesn't have to be out loud laughable. Having a sense of humor just means walking or traveling through this world with a lightheartedness that allows us to cope with our everyday tensions in a way that promotes our survival. And so sometimes doing enough to just meet that expectation is good and is great and enhances and makes more intimate our relationships with one another.
Yeah, I like that as an ending note. I mean, yeah, the existential of torture that is life is unrelenting, and so if we can at least be like, well, if I'm here, I'm at least gonna like throw some pies in some faces, that might help us. That might help us a little bit. Well, thank you so much, Tara. I really appreciate you joining. This would be the end of the season, but we do have one more episode coming next week. It's going to be a long one, but a good one. So I'll see everyone there one more time. We're going to talk about the love languages. I'm looking forward to that one. Take care, everybody. Have a great end of semester.
You've been listening to Red Rock Relationships, a podcast about communication. Thank you so much for giving us some of your time. If you'd like to be on the show or have questions for us, please send us an email to redrockrelationships@gmail.com. You can also find us on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, Spotify, or wherever you listen to your podcasts. Just search Red Rock Relationships. Thank you again. And remember, it all begins with good communication. This has been a production from A Podcast Studio.